The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 13. The Captain. It was the year 1980, and the only thing that made me laugh was the absurdity of existence itself. Life had no meaning or point. People of the class I was born into woke up, went to work and went back to sleep again, probably with my grandmother's mantra of beggars can't be choosers deterring them from entering La La Land. They did this day in, day out. What did they get out of life? A steak dinner rather than a pork chop on Friday night? A weekend in Bournemouth as a reward for making it through another fucking year? Although my mother, my brother and I lived at 1 Foul Street, we might as well have been living on separate continents. We more remembered each other than recognised each other. We seldom made inquiries as to each other's day. We lived in our minds as we came and went. I had an after-school job walking a dog for the owner of a country pub. He was an old friend of my parents named Steve, an ex-boxer and cop, and he was quick to take me under his paternal wing. The dog I walked for him was a miniature poodle named Freddie. I didn't know that Freddie was Sooner, my long-lost love and soulmate, but I knew Freddie's love for me was unconditional, and it made me feel special. I was not the dog's owner, but he only responded to me. It was as if he was being defiant. I could almost hear Freddie say to his owners, "It's Sarah I love, but thank you anyway." I would do odd jobs too, like organise the empty mixer bottles to be returned, and I set up fly traps. On weekends I would collect the dirty glasses and wipe down the tables after lunch. Steve had known my parents since the 60s and offered my mother a job at the Otter Inn as well. She began working on Friday and Saturday evenings, but only to socialise, as she put it, because she had enough money in the bank from the sale of our old house to pay the bills and coast for a while. My daily routine consisted of waking up and getting dressed for school in whatever tarty outfit I could assemble. The only thing I wanted to spend my money on was clothes, cheaply made fashions purchased monthly during low-budget shopping trips, and if I could steal something here and there I would do that too. I wasn't as good a thief as I might have been though. The thought of getting caught and my mum finding out was an ironclad deterrent most trips. Occasionally I would take money out of her purse, but the wool was not easily pulled over her eyes. Despite the fact that my mother spent most of her time living in some mental elsewhere, her awareness of her physical surroundings was sinisterly keen. She knew exactly how much money was in her purse, how many cigarettes were in her pack, how much fuel was in her lighter, how much petrol was in her car, and how many steps it would take to reach it in the car park across the street. And by the time she'd pulled the first pint, she would have known which of the male customers were not wearing wedding bands. Because my mum never missed a trick, I never got into trouble with the police, which would have been a predictable outcome for a resentful teenager left to her own devices. But what really kept me out of trouble was the thought of disappointing her. My mother's approval meant everything, which was funny because I didn't approve of her at all. When my mother did engage me, it was usually to talk about herself. Her participation in my life was offensively minimal. It struck me one day that her approach to nurturing her offspring was much like a reptile whose eggs hatched long after she had happily abandoned them. My mother and I argued about the way I looked, but I was more persistent than she when it came to getting my own way. She eventually shrugged her shoulders in a gesture that said, "Fuck it, do what you like, I can't stop you," which was absolutely true. I wore a lot of makeup, well applied, at 2 London nightclubs for an adolescent 13-year-old girl living in the boondocks. I sought attention, but the wrong kind, and I got it. The girls at school disliked me intensely. I should have realised that remaining low-key was the best way to fit into a new school, not parading around like a peacock. I shared a large bedroom with my brother, which had 2 clumsy balsa wood shelving units dividing the room down the middle. We weren't able to see each other when we slept, but apart from that, the lack of private space was intolerable. I would lie in bed at night listening to my brother's sleep and mentally list all the reasons I objected to the conditions of life on Earth. My complaints read like a shopping list. I didn't realise that later on in life this habit would take Herculean efforts to break. One day when I came home from school, I noticed my mother sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped up in her thoughts with a higher degree of intensity than usual. I intuitively knew this meant that she was plotting something. My mother wanted exactly what she didn't have. Romance with a Cary Grant look-alike, bouquets of flowers, candlelit dinners, a stately home with manicured grounds. But all she had was her lonely double bed she shared with her 3 cats, some potted plants that didn't get enough sunlight, and cheap cuts of meat that she would have to braise for hours to tenderize, all within the noisy walls of a small terraced house circumspectly built on a main trunk road that the nosy neighbours overlooked. I walked outside and onto the grounds of my mum's less than stately home, which consisted of a 20 by 20 backyard that the pigeons used as a toilet. I looked around for any signs of the neighbours. There were none. I sat on an old tree stump, uneasy as I watched my mum through the window. I tried to imagine what she was thinking about. I hit the mark quite quickly. My mother's plan to meet a new man was executed the following Friday. My mother had a good figure and had bought some new dresses. She had very good taste, not overdoing the jewellery or the makeup. It's important not to look like mutton dressed up as lamb, she once told me while getting ready. My mother had a smile on her face as she closed the front door behind her, and an even bigger smile when she arrived home. "I met a captain," she said smugly. She did not tell me that she intended to marry him as soon as she could make it happen. I just listened while she told me of their first beautiful encounter. She didn't notice me gag. While staring into her gullible eyes from across the bar, the captain had apparently told my mum the essence of his life story. He had been educated at the prestigious Stonyhurst College and spent many years, well spent apparently, captaining a boat that ferried tourists from the Caribbean island of Bonaire to Curacao. He told her that he owned a large house outright that overlooked the bay in the nearby town of Sidmouth, and that he had recently rented the house out on a 2-year lease because it was just too big for one person. It wasn't until after they were married that my mother found out that the house he had proudly given us all a guided tour of was owned by a friend of his who lived there with his wife and kids. They were gone for the weekend when we all showed up. The captain was not able to work because he was not employable, too old, well into his 70s, registered disabled, and so walked with a cane and preferred to spend his days watching cricket. But he was able and very willing to tell my mother what she wanted to hear, that she was beautiful and funny, cherished, and he couldn't imagine life without her. This yarn worked well in the beginning, but frayed quite quickly. When she found out my new stepfather had lied to her about the Sidmouth house, it ate away at her. She had really believed this would be where we would all be living. After some polite inquiry, my mother had pieced together the truth of her third husband's fraudulent life. They had only been married for 9 weeks. Without embarrassment, which I hoped would follow, my mother accepted the fact that she had married a pretender who had probably been pretending all his life. The last time I saw the captain, he was sitting in my mother's favourite armchair, blankly staring at his chilly wife, who was sitting opposite and blankly staring back at him. 2 people with identical and therefore contradictory agendas were facing each other for the final time. My mother had packed her soon-to-be ex-husband's bag, and the captain unceremoniously left the house with only the burlap holdall he arrived with. I wondered where he would go next. Relatives, a park bench, a nursing home. No one knew where he had come from. Our imaginations? It had all been so quick. But I disliked stepfather number 3 intensely, and he me. He did not like people who were able to see through him. I made him nervous. I was glad he was gone, but any respect I had for my mother had been replaced with the idea that she was delusional. She knew I felt this way, and because I was now pushing 14 years old, and in many ways I was a very mature 14, a silent standoff existed between 2 women. My mother was now very difficult to get along with, and I even more so. My mother wanted to have her marriage to the captain annulled, and as she was filling out the paperwork, I noticed her plotting again. It became obvious to my mother that the Otter Inn was not a grand enough place to meet the type of man who must surely be waiting in the wings somewhere for her. So the following morning she applied for a job at an upmarket hotel and restaurant called the Monkton Court. She was interviewed the following day and began work the following night. Serving behind the bar gave her direct access to the clientele, and she loved it, especially the attention of a resident customer named Roy. Roy was new in town, recently divorced from his wife, number 3, and the coincidence of this confirmed to my mother that they must be made for each other. After hearing about her recent debacle with the captain, which she had probably turned into a hilarious anecdote to entertain the bar, Roy recommended that she get the locks changed. Roy showed up at our house the following day with a toolbox and a cigar he sucked compulsively on. Roy was the locksmith. My mother's shameless longing for a saviour had been answered again, as if the answer to a prayer. The way she looked at the locksmith made me want to ram my head into a brick wall.